Good morning and good afternoon to all our attendees. We have a steadily growing number of attendees at the moment, so we're just going to wait for a moment to allow a few more people to join. Just bear with us a moment while we wait for people to join us. Thank you very much. I'm just going to take an arbitrary decision and wait until we've reached 95 participants. We're at 92 right now, and then we will begin. May I remind everybody at this stage that we are recording this event. That means that if you write anything in the questions with your name, that you will be sharing your name with other people. So for GDPR purposes, you will therefore be consenting for your name to be used. But I do want to assure you that we won't be using that chat function for anything other than, the Q&A function for anything other than this session here today. Should we make any report of it, we will not refer to anybody by name without first ensuring that people are comfortable with their name being used. But as a matter of principle, we won't be reporting anything by name. So we now have substantially over 100 people with us. So we're going to continue. We will, I'm sure, have other people joining us as we go on. But that's the nature of lunchtime sessions for those who are in Europe, lunchtime sessions, that we will be having people join us as we go. Let me begin by welcoming you to this event. My name is Petra Wilson. I work for FTI Consulting, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is hosted by PTC Therapeutics and ARM, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicines. And we are bringing you this event today in order to explore together, and with a very established and wonderful panel, how to make a success story of cell and gene therapies in Europe. Let me just take a moment to remind us all what we're talking about. There are, of course, a growing number of advanced therapy medicinal products known as ATMPs, which include cell and gene therapies coming to market in Europe. And they bring great hope and suffering, great hope to patients suffering from serious, often rare, and often previously unaddressed diseases. Many of these therapies are life-changing. They address the underlying causes of disease and often replace lifelong chronic treatment with a single administration or just a few treatments. And so they offer a tremendous benefit to patients, and they also address some of the significant burdens that healthcare systems face in long-term treatments of chronic diseases. Much has been accomplished to accelerate cell and gene therapies regulatory review and approval in Europe, and there are some promising developments also on the patient access side. However, bringing an ATMP to patients is still very challenging. The key challenges include challenges to do with the one-off costs, but also the practical and ethical limitations of running randomized controlled trials, the use and the new reliance on real-world evidence, and the uncertainty that still exists about long-term efficacy because these are such new treatments. Also, they are complex and difficult to both manufacture and administrate. And in Europe, there are still only a few highly specialized treatment centers in certain countries or even in regions of countries. And that makes access difficult. It also means that reimbursement decisions take time, are in many cases still in development. The European institutions and regulatory bodies have been very supportive in bringing these new treatments to market in certain target areas. And the European Medicines Agency, the EMA, has granted orphan status to some ATMPs in development, and that we now have 29 that have benefited from the EMA Prime scheme for accelerated approval. but there are still a number of challenges that exist. And these challenges are what we're going to address here in this webinar today. We have an amazing panel with us, and we're going to be kicked off in our discussions with none other than Professor Guido Razi, who I'm sure everybody in this taking part in this seminar will remember from his role as Executive Director of the EMA. And during that time, he was, of course, extremely involved in bringing those 29 products that we now have through the regulatory process. So we're going to open the session by inviting Professor Guido Razi to tell us a little bit about what the biggest challenges are about bringing cell and gene therapies to market in Europe, but also what Europe can do to ensure that it maintains an attractive place for bringing and developing cell and gene therapies to market, because there is, of course, a global competition, and we want to ensure not only that Europe can do the best for its patients, but that Europe can also find its place in this global market. Professor Razi, do please kick us off. Thank you very much. Oh, before you do, I forgot a key issue. Of course, people will want to ask you and our other panelists questions. For the participants, do please feel free to use the Q&A function, which you will see at the bottom of your screens, to ask questions. We will see those questions. I may group some questions together in order to ask our panelists questions on your behalf. We will get through as many questions as possible, so do please be active, be very active in using the Q&A function to ask your questions. Thank you very much. And now over to you, Professor Razi. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Yes, I'm very, very happy that even after my the completion of my institutional duty at EMA, I can be still involved in this very promising, very future-looking field of the ATMPs. As you say, the ATMPs are definitely are coming now. I know I left EMA with a very intense pipeline on ATMPs, and jointly I expect that EMA and FDA will have in their pipeline for the next 5 years up to 30% of all the new therapies coming being in the ATMP domain. So that's a very encouraging, very promising, but also needs to have it needs to have an environment ready for that, a friendly environment to foster and to encourage and to motivate the investment. As you know, the regulatory world is moving already to try to accomplish it, to welcome this, to make it happen, that this very cutting edge and promising therapies are coming. FDA has done a lot with the precision medicine, with a lot of initiative, but focusing on Europe, where we have a more complex environment. Also, I know that already you mentioned, Petra, that EMA promoted some initiative within the current legislative framework, which is, of course, a legislative framework has been designed for a completely different set of medicines. But time is going fast, and so within this current legislation, the changes that can done are limited, even so far still consented to approve some drug. We had the first gene therapy about the thalassemia. That was a challenging first attempt to see within the current legislative framework to make it happen. Of course, was an extreme an extreme therapy for very rare disease, very few people, where the compelling evidence could have been achieved with a very few cases. That is a very good proof of concept. I will call a proof of concept because not all the next coming will be the same. But in that case, very few cases consented because, as I say, that the evidence was so compelling that there was no difficulties to approve. But we know that many other will not come at the same speed. They will need a different approaches, different study design, different reassurance to make comfortable all the authorities thereafter, the regulatory authority first, but all the other health authority that will be using and paying and delivering these therapies need to be reassured as much as the regulators. Why I'm saying this? Because for many other, the time frame to see the benefit will be much longer. For the thalassemia was fast enough to reassure everything. That was, as you know, just the avoidance of the transfusion, the reduction of the transfusion, and the immediate outcome, the immediate benefit was detectable, even if the price was, of course, an issue as they are. On the positive side, and then I will go to address the more specific problems. On the positive side, I cannot avoid to mention COVID in this time. The COVID showed us about innovation that different approaches and massive focus can produce spectacular results. And I see here, before I address the environment, I will make this comment for the industrial side, for the production, for the companies. We have seen that the platform like the Active, where different expertise for different companies of different sizes benefited each other of the achievement of one. In terms of the design of the epitopes for the vaccine that used by Moderna and others is one very impressive achievement, and so far and so forth. So a lot of achievement has been shared in this platform in a pre-competitive space with a very I would say very agile way to use each one license and platform, and of course an impressive amount of public money put on it, 10 millions if I'm not mistaken. So the development model should also be considered, and that will certainly reduce the cost and facilitate and accelerate the development. And with this, I transition for the last few minutes. I don't want to take much of the time, but I know that these are the problem. We know that the elephant in the room is the access. We might have these therapies, but access is the key problem, mostly in Europe, where the most of the therapies and the cure are paid by the third party, whereas an insurance, where is the public money is paid by the third party. That need to be reassured, and this need to happen fast. So what there is a need to address. I identified at least 5 regulations that will converge and will need to be addressed to make it happen, to have an accommodating environment and a hosting environment. Is the device, the regulation about device. Devices need to be integrated with all the others, with the pharmaceutical and with other regulation, which is the the data regulation, and not only the data protection, which is one regulation, the GDPR, that need to be adjusted for the ATMPs. The GMO regulation, the genetic modified organisms are deeply involved in this development and are not suiting always this development. The GMP, the hospital exemption, and the ATMPs, plus, of course, the pharmaceutical regulation. All of these, and on top of this, there is a need for the new data management, the IT system in Europe, the big data, and the possibility to enable the use, to enable the real world evidence, to enable the long-term pharmacovigilance. You say that, Petra, that is a long-term effect, and you need a long-term, maybe a lifetime observation. These need to be accommodated with new tools. We cannot use the paper tool. We cannot use the dispersed register in different nations. We need to have the electronic record adjusted, integrated, organized, in order that all the benefit for these therapies that come in little group, very dispersed in a large territory, need to be shared, available, and analyzed from all the authorities in a very short time, in a very efficient time, in order to reassure everybody about the effect, the efficacy, and the safety, this to be captured and to be dealt with. I can go on and on, but I think this is, in a nutshell, is the nucleus of the problem. And I think we can expand this in the next coming speeches and questions. I would stop here, Petra. If you are...
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. That's given us an amazing overview. And I think one of the other things that you've made us realize is what a breadth of legislative issues this covers, whether it's things like GDPR, real world evidence, the way in which we collect data, GMOs, GMP. We're also identifying, of course, that this is yet another example of European alphabet soup. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us. I'm going to pass over in a moment to MEP Dolores Montserrat from the European Parliament, who to ask her to expand on some of these issues around the legislative challenges. But I did just want to first pose one question from the chat to you. You mentioned this, there are two people who've asked questions related to issues around the evidence that is required within bringing an ATMP to market, and also evaluating its long-term use. And you mentioned, Professor Razi, that the GDPR is not necessarily fit for purpose for the ATMPs. Is there just one thing that you want to highlight about that before we move to MEP Montserrat?
Yes, about GDPR. GDPR with ATMPs has two potential problems. One is the very limited number of people participating to the study for its own nature, mostly. Now the developments are in the field of rare diseases. The anonymization is absolutely challenging sometimes. And the secondary use of data in Europe with the new GDPR is not completely clear. This, I've been in contact with many investors in US, and there is a very, very high and huge concern about the possibility that this GDPR, not a lack of clarity on the usage of the secondary use of this data, which will be essential for this kind of development, for the reason that you say that is a long term, that there are a lot of activity, and real world evidence will be one of the key. So the GDPR should consider this. And the concern of investors is very high. And I know that the Commission is working with the data protection supervisor, but there is a need to have clarity.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sure this is something that we'll come to again later in the discussions, not least as we think about how the emerging European health data space can address some of these challenges. I can see that MEP Montserrat is having some challenges in connecting. So I'm going to jump to one of our panelists, and I'm very happy to be able to welcome Avril Daly from Retina International to our panel. Avril, amongst your many roles, you're here today representing the patient's perspective on this. And Professor Razi has, of course, set out for us some of the legislative issues and challenges that we need to overcome. But the whole point of these wonderful new medications is to help patients. Would you like to kick us off by giving us a little bit of the patient perspective on the challenges of cell and gene therapies? Thank you.
Of course, yes. And, of course, as you say, the hope that cell and gene therapies bring to our community is enormous. Patients are very well informed about what is happening from the perspective of research all the way through, from concept to delivery, very engaged and very understanding. But I think it's very important for us as patients to, bring this back to basics in a way. And for us, the more we look at this, the more we see where the challenges are. It does bring us back to, what are the basic issues? And to be very honest with you, if we're going to talk about, genetic therapies, cell therapies, we have to understand how we identify our patients who will benefit from these therapies and how they in turn, through that identification, can engage in the process faster and better so that we can, improve the process and accelerate that process. One of the key issues here that, often gets lost in the discussion is the issue of genetic testing services. They are completely inconsistent at a European level. They're unavailable, and in some countries are considered, not a clinical discipline at all, and are unavailable to patients. So, we have a critical issue here, in Europe as well, that we have a shortage of genetic specialists and genetic counselors who are best positioned not only to provide these tests, but also to provide the interpretation of these tests. Genetic testing informs not only a care pathway for patients, but really leads to better research and innovation. So, for example, I've had a genetic test. I'm a person living with an inherited retinal degeneration. I was diagnosed in my early 20s, but it wasn't until my early 40s that I received a genetic test. And I received that, in fact, through something called Target 5000, which is a charity in Ireland called Fighting Blindness, which set up a research and registered charity where they're testing 5,000 patients that they know should, that's the number of patients they expect will have an IRD in the country. So I had a test. I had been told for years and years, 20 years almost, that I had a recessive gene. The genetic test showed me that, in fact, I had a de novo gene. So not only did that, alleviate a lot of pressure that I had myself worrying about other family members who might develop this condition, but it showed that I had quite an unusual gene, and that in fact this gene was being researched, and it was quite a complex gene. And my being part of that project allowed my information to be stored on a register that was going to be used globally, that I could get access to that information, and that should there be a genetic, a clinical trial in that area, they would know where to find me, right? So this is very simple and straightforward. A charity shouldn't be incumbent on a small charity to try to develop these types of systems. They should be available to everybody. They should be available to people who are affected by slightly more common rare diseases, if you'd like to call them that. But also, what about these ultra rare patients, who don't have the capacity to do that? Where do they go to get access to a genetic test that will allow them to be, part of that entire pathway? So we must consider genetic testing as the very basic issue here. But that brings us on, of course, to the issue of registers, and registers are critically important. And to Professor Rassi's point, there are issues here, interoperability, and how we address this particular issue. I would say that patients who have worked on the development as advocates of the European reference networks since about 2004 now, we really see the European reference networks as being pivotal in pulling all of this together. They're currently developing registers, and now they're only fermenting. It's very early days. ERNs have only been, in operation for 5 years, and they really need a lot of support, not only from us as the community, but also from the Commission, to allow them to develop and be that all they can be. But patients really see how ERNs could play a stronger role in innovation and in the whole discussion and in a practical way around emerging therapies. So, we do have some very critical issues on the ground, if you like, to deal with. And often we talk about the issue of cost, the issue of value. But really, if we don't get the basics right, the fundamentals, we're always going to have these issues. We're always going to have these challenges. So I would say, let's look at the basics. Let's look at the fundamentals and see what we can address together in order to deal with these, and how they in turn can not only bring therapies through the process faster, but they can also improve patients' lives at the same time, and the delivery of care.
Thank you very much. I think you've raised some really important issues there. I'm sure we will come back to those again, but I think we're already seeing a pattern emerge of two issues that we need to think about, not only the legislative framework and the breadth of that Professor Rassi has explained, but you also in terms of some of the on the ground realities. And I think, and I thank you for sharing your personal experience and the fact that actually an awful lot of the benefits that are being achieved at the moment are funded by charities. And is that the way that we should be going forward? I'd like to move now to MEP Dolores Montserrat. Thank you so much for joining us. We know that you're extremely busy today, and that you're actually also in the process of talking around some of these issues in the European Parliament today. So we're very grateful that you've taken some time out for us. I think what we're very keen to hear from you is your perspective on what's happening at the European Parliament level in terms of addressing some of the challenges. Before you managed to join us, Professor Rassi kindly laid out some of the areas of legislative, where more legislative development is needed. Of course, addressing issues around the pharmaceutical legislation, but also recognizing that the GMO legislation is relevant, as well as the legislation around data from GDPR and across other areas. Perhaps you could share with us some of your feelings about where you see the bigger challenges and also opportunities, if you will. And then we'll be delighted to have you with us for as long as you're able to stay. I believe you're on mute at the moment, so you may need to unmute yourself before you can intervene. There you go.
Thank you very much. Dear all, good morning, and thank you very much. It is a big pleasure to me be with you and with my friend, with Rassi too. The pandemic has accelerated the path on which this European legislature has embarked from its beginning. In the Commission and in the European Parliament, we have made health a top priority. And over the past year, we have laid the first building blocks in the construction of the European Union of Health, with the COVID-19 vaccine strategy, with the strengthening of the ECDC and the EMA, with the creation of the ERA and its incubator, with the new autonomous European Union for Health program, the European Union plan, the Beating Cancer plan, and with the new pharmaceutical strategy for Europe, which together launched the European Decade of Health and Research. And I think so that begins a big opportunity to all of us. I'm the rapporteur on the pharmaceutical strategy for Europe, and this strategy highlights four great challenges: the equal access to medicines all over Europe, more investments in research and innovation, a competitive and strategic pharmaceutical industry, and of course, the sustainability of the national health systems in Europe. Because always I'm saying that, you know, the big difference between the United States and Europe, it's these national health systems that are universal for everybody and gives access to everybody. So the availability of the EMA-approved medicines in different countries can vary from 7 to 90% depending on the country. Of particular concerns is the issue of unmet therapeutic needs. 95% of the 7,000 rare diseases still have no treatment option, and more than 30 million patients in Europe are asking us for an answer. The availability of innovative orphan and pediatric oncology drugs is scarce and discontinuous. Neurodegenerative disease threatened to be a silent epidemic with more than 10 million Europeans affected by Alzheimer's disease. So we need to incentivize industry with new approach to do more research and invest in drug development to meet these unmet needs. Antimicrobial resistance is responsible for the death of 33,000 people in Europe each year. So the growing number of advanced therapy medicines products, such as cell, gene therapies, offer greater hope to patients suffering from serious, often rare, and previously unaddressed disease. Some of these therapies are life-changing, addressing the underlying causes of disease and replacing lifelong chronic treatments with a single administration or a few injections. When I was a Minister of Health, I had the opportunity to see with my own eyes the effects of gene therapies. Gene and cell therapies, personalized medicine, nanotechnology, next generation vaccines, e-health, and the million-plus genomes initiatives can bring enormous benefits in the prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and post-treatment of all disease. So these new frontiers treatments can broadly contribute to the sustainability of the national health systems. However, we need the Commission to develop appropriate regulatory framework to guide new business models and to promote information campaigns to raise awareness and encourage the application of these innovations. The Parliament and the Commission are committed to these innovations and will do their best efforts to allow its broader use while guaranteeing the safety and efficacy of the treatment. So I think that now there is a big opportunity that we have to do it all together, because now we are starting the decade of health. The COVID, you know, it has been a big disaster for all of us in all around Europe, but in the same time puts opportunity in Europe to build this European Union for health with all these tools that I explained, and in the same time to put the focus on the patient and to put the focus in this future decade on health of our patients. And in the same time, like Europe is leading in the world climate change fight, we can lead from Europe the taking care of our patients, not just in Europe, in all around the world. Why? Because we have a big difference between our competitors, that we have the health public systems, and we have to procure for their sustainability. And I think so that these therapies, it's going to help to the patients, to the state members, to the Europe, and of course to the industry. So let's do it all together. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That I think you've given us a glimpse of the hope that's on the horizon with the new initiatives in EU for Health. but also some of the challenges. Now, both you and Professor Razi have highlighted what we've learned from COVID, and you've mentioned that COVID has taught us many things. The challenge, I guess, is now really learning those lessons and not just saying that was emergency response during COVID time. We can now go back to business as normal. So I'm going to move to Thomas Bols from PTC Therapeutics in a moment to share a little bit about the reality of bringing such a product to market. But then I think it would be really useful to come back to each of you and to dig a little bit into this issue around what we've learned from COVID and how we can make sure that those lessons don't just fall to the back of the drawer somewhere. But let me turn first to Thomas Bols from PTC Therapeutics. You're kindly one of the supporters of this event here today. Can you share a little bit with this audience about the realities and the challenges of bringing a new gene therapy to the market?
Yeah, sure, Petra. Hi, everybody. Happy to do so. So yes, I work for PTC. So maybe 2 words on PTC. We are a biopharmaceutical company, mid-size. So we've only recently welcomed 1,000 employee globally. But I think we're almost uniquely qualified for the topics we're discussing today, because on the one hand, we are focusing exclusively on rare diseases. So people that know us will know us from therapies for rare diseases like Duchenne muscular atrophy. And on the other hand, we use different technologies to develop therapies, but one of them is definitely gene therapies, and we hope to bring a gene therapy to patients in the not too distant future. So this combination of being active in gene therapies for rare diseases is I think particularly relevant for the discussions that we have today. Before I go into sort of how we see the opportunities and challenges of a gene therapy and bringing it to patients, I just wanted to kick off maybe with talk about the excitement and the great opportunities cell and gene therapies are offering. I think there's a lot of scientific and clinical progress has been made, as we could also hear from Professor Razi. Particularly in 2020 was a year of significant growth. If you take simple statistics, I think there are over 1,000 companies now worldwide active in this space, and they are engaged in more than 1,000, I think more than 1,100 clinical trials with cell and gene therapies, of which 10% is in phase 3. I'm sure Paige from ARM, who monitor this very closely, will talk more about that. So we already have thousands of patients are actually benefiting from cell and gene therapies, and the impact, of course, is quite dramatic on the life of patients. We don't like to use the word curative, but these kind of therapies have that potential, and definitely on the life of patients, the impact is tremendous. There are several products in the final stages, including one gene therapy from PTC. And I think it's also important to underline that this field is moving from focusing maybe primarily almost on oncology to really other disease areas, and I can see that in our own company as well. And yes, we focus very much, these therapies are at the moment very much on rare disease patients, but I think the future will also bring these therapies to patients with larger disease populations. So just to kick this off, I want to just to give a very practical sort of run through from what it takes to develop a gene therapy and what are the different policy challenges that you have at each stage of that development. So if you start with research and development, as we say, I think cell and gene therapies are predominantly developed by small, mid-sized biopharmaceutical companies. And that's because they have the knowledge and the infrastructure to develop these products safe and efficaciously. But there are also other entities involved in this field, such as hospitals, etc. In particular, of course, in areas where there's a high unmet medical need and a centrally approved, EMA-approved therapy is not yet available. And Europe provides sort of legislation for that, to allow that, which is a bit different from, call it, traditional medicines, where I think you see almost exclusively biopharmaceutical companies being active. So there are rules around the so-called hospital exemptions and so on, so to allow this kind of non-centrally approved products to be authorized. But these rules are nationally managed. And so what we've seen is that this has created a very uneven playing field in Europe because of the different interpretations at the national level. And so we think that this needs to be regulated better in the interest of patients, and also to not to jeopardize the incentivization of innovation, of course. So these rules need to be adapted. So that's the first challenge at that stage, I would say. Then if you move to, and I think it was talked again, I think Professor Razi mentioned this, when you talk about clinical trials, this is a whole new area for gene therapies, in the sense that the traditional setting up of clinical trial, generating data through the clinical trial system, is not really possible for gene therapies and cell and gene therapies. These are therapies that are designed for small patient populations, so already finding patients is challenging. You cannot generate enough data through, as I said, large scale trials. And also, often we see that these kind of therapies need to be administered through surgery or other modes of administration, which are quite invasive. So to have sort of placebo-controlled trials, etc., is really not possible. And so then the topic of real-world evidence, or data collected after marketing authorization, becomes relatively more important for cell and gene therapies. And what we see is that on the one hand, regulators like EMA and so on are very accustomed to working with real-world evidence as a total package of the data generation presented to regulators. We see that HTA bodies and others and payers have more difficulties with that. And also that there is a slight discrepancy between what regulators want and what HTA bodies want. So that's another big challenge in that area, in the data generation, that I think we need to settle. If you then move to the reimbursement, so even if you have then an approval based on that data and you need to get reimbursed at the national level, we sort of see the next challenge, again, due to the nature of cell and gene therapies. And these are mainly linked to either what I said just before, the limited data is something that HTA bodies and payers have really difficulties with accepting. But also this unique characteristics of cell and gene therapies of a one-off treatment, one-off payment. So that you have this fairly high upfront payment, and then of course the effect is for the long term. And we see that most HTA and payer systems in Europe are really not set up to that. They're really set up for, call it, chronic payment for chronic treatment. And so that's a challenge that I think we also really need to address. And then finally, my last point is really at the patient level, because what we see, of course, as well, and I think the previous speaker mentioned this, is that we are with these therapies in a situation where patients are all over Europe, but most often these gene therapies, cell and gene therapies, need to be administered in a few highly specialized centers that are then available only in a few countries. So that means you, as a patient, you will have to probably, not all patients, but a significant number of patients will need to travel from their country to these centers. So the topic of cross-border health, as it is called, that Europe also has legislation on, needs to improve, because we see that this legislation is in place for I think more than 10 years. It works certainly for certain treatments, but it doesn't really work well for this kind of highly specialized treatment that we see coming up with cell and gene therapies. So the last challenge there, or at least as an example, is that we need to improve the situation for patients when it comes to getting treatment abroad. So all of these challenges, I think, are solvable. We can definitely fix them, and we need to fix them if we really want this sector to flourish and really get to where we want in terms of new therapies for patients. Because in the end of the day, I think it's really important that we create indeed this environment so that patients can have access to these treatments. So that's maybe as a concrete flavor of what we're dealing with as a company. Thanks.
Thank you. That's an amazing run through the challenges. And I think it makes us realize how grateful we as patients, as European citizens, need to be that there are companies that are willing to address all these many challenges and hurdles, because they are significant. We're going to come back to a few of the questions that are on the chat in a moment, but we do have two other panelists, and I do want to make sure that I come to them. So I'm now going to move to Paige Bischoff, who is from ARM. And Paige, I'm going to ask you to say a few words about ARM, but then also to talk about where we stand in Europe compared to the rest of the world. And I would like to acknowledge that we're very grateful to you to joining us from the other side of the world, where it is very early indeed still. So thank you for coming with us so early. Paige, over to you.
Thanks so much, Petra, and good afternoon, everybody. ARM is the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and we've been in existence for about 12 years, and we are the largest global advocacy organization on behalf of ATMPs. We have over 380 members, and 85 of those members and growing are in Europe. So now to get to your question. Well, Europe started off as a global leader. Of course, EMA was the very first regulatory body to approve an ATMP anywhere in the world, and has continued to lead in terms of cell and gene therapy approvals. That said, the availability of the therapies does vary widely across the member states. And so that has really become a focal point for us, and I think for Europe too. If we look at, just for example, one gene therapy that treats a rare disease in children, which unfortunately causes a progressive loss of mobility, intellectual decline, and is usually fatal. Now, this gene therapy actually was approved last year in late 2020 by EMA. It's been shown to be actually curative in these children. And the difference is, though, you look at, so far it's received a positive HTA opinion in Germany, but it's still under review in the UK and France, and it hasn't begun its review in Italy. And each EMA approved therapy really has kind of a similar story. So the timelines and different decisions on HTA and reimbursements across member states is pronounced. In the last few years, we have seen some signs, unfortunately, emerging that Europe's falling behind both the US and even Asia on some key measures that really relate to the strength of the sector going forward. So, for example, clinical trials, very key indicator. From 2018 to 2020, there were 75% more trials that were started in the US and 27% more that were started in Asia as compared to Europe. And unfortunately, again, the story is the same when it comes to developers. So just last year in 2020, in Europe, there were 209 cell, gene, and tissue-based therapy developers, which sounds like a good number, except that it's actually a decrease of 3% from just 2 years earlier. If you compare that to Asia, there was a 78% growth in the number of developers and 11% growth in the US. Also, as Thomas mentioned, clinical trial delays, and a key contributing reason is what Professor Razi mentioned, and that is the GMO legislation issue. And it's really applied unevenly across member states. So ARM and two other European organizations just published in the official journal of the European Society of Cell and Gene Therapy a paper, and the paper is really calling for the permanent exemption of those GMO requirements going forward for gene therapies, just as the Commission temporarily relaxed those requirements for COVID-19 vaccine development. And as Professor Razi again was talking about, and MEP Monserrat, what we've learned from COVID-19 vaccine development, we really think that GMO is one area. Additionally, the trilogue negotiations are underway on the joint clinical assessments for HTA, which I believe Ms. Giorgio will talk about momentarily. We certainly, from the ATMP perspective, would really like to see the Commission, the Council, and Parliament come together on a compromise that avoids any duplication of work and the resulting unnecessary delays in patient access. So we really feel like the pharma legislation revision is a great opportunity for the European Union to reverse some of these trends and to really signal Europe's commitment to leading in the ATMP sector in what is increasingly becoming a very competitive global environment. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Paige. That's given us some lovely perspectives, and it's highlighted the challenges that we face on that global stage. Now I'd like to move to Flora Giorgio, who is representing the European Commission, and you has a wealth and many years of experience in working in the challenges of health technology assessment generally, and also latterly within this domain of new ATMPs and cell and gene therapies. So Flora, I'd like to ask you to reflect a little bit on how the new HTA legislation is going to be implemented for gene therapies. And once the agreement is reached on the HTA dossier, do you believe that how do you believe it will really impact cell and gene therapies? Flora, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Petra, for the introduction. Thanks to the panelists. Apologies for being a bit late, and I missed the first intervention, and because in fact we are just conducting the trialogue on the legislation, which is proceeding positively despite very tough, as you have probably all heard, the 3 years of intense negotiation between the Commission and in the Council mainly. I think maybe to come back on the question before, what did we learn from COVID? I think that the COVID emergency has also put everything a bit in perspective, and even in the challenging HTA proposal negotiation, there has been a kind of turning point where all parties have realized the importance of strengthening cooperation in the challenging area in health in general, but in particular also on the health technology assessment, which several of the other speakers, panelists have highlighted, is actually an area where you should and you could bring much more convergence and predictability with a more I say convergence. I don't like to refer to the harmonized approach, but convergent approach. I think that's what the HTA proposal is all about at the end. It's about try to reduce, first of all, to ensure a better alignment of evidence requirement also in a pre-launch market phase, and evidence requirement between HTA bodies among themselves, but more importantly, also HTA bodies and regulators. And this is something that we see could be extremely beneficial for all innovative technology, in particular when there are high innovation, and especially for companies that have, a small, medium-sized company, as Thomas was saying, that are mainly the main provider of these highly innovative products. Having a better predictability and alignment of evidence requirement through the joint scientific consultation, the early dialogue, scientific advice in the EMA wording, I think that's a major, we could say, contribution to address the challenge. And it's a contribution that is also well reflected in the pharma strategy, in the sense that, there is this approach of a better life cycle approach to evidence generation, which is important for all medicines, but again, in particularly for highly innovative technology. It's not only the magic moment of the entry into the market, but it's how the medicine performs and the technology performs over time. So I think that's an important contribution already, the alignment. The other element is what has been always most, let's say, discussed when talking about HTA. The HTA proposes the joint assessment. So the fact really that there is a common base of evidence which are submitted to all member states in a unified, in an harmonized way. There will be, hopefully soon, a EU dossier for a joint assessment, and that would again increase the predictability, and we would say the evidence-based for everybody, both technology developer and HTA bodies. And last but not least, obviously, the most important outcome, the joint assessment, the fact that there will be more convergence on how evidence are looked at. Obviously, this will not change the reality that member states takes their access decision based on their willingness to pay, on their budget situation, on their national healthcare system organization. But what will surely improve is, first of all, the access to timely facts and information available, because the joint assessment would be available very early, to a certain extent, in the face of the medicines, would provide a solid evidence base to all member states. And this we see it also already now in the joint action on ETA. This increases the convergence and also the way evidence are looked at, and therefore decisions are taken at national level in terms of access decision, because obviously, and that was also one of the very controversial elements of this proposal, that obviously when you have a common set of evidence, you have a common joint assessment that looks at the clinical evidence, you have to consider that, to use it in your national decision-making process. And that's where we see, a major advantage on the proposal. The other element maybe to mention, which I think it is important to underline, even though it's not a lot on the spotlight, is actually that in the proposal, we also try to make it more and more visible. In HTA process, you need not only the assessor, but also you need to have access to specific expertise. So the involvement of expert, specific patient expert, clinical expert in the assessment process at a relevant stage. And that's extremely important to capture, for instance, the patient perspective when deciding about the scoping and the outcome that HTA should look at. And as well, the broader issue of the stakeholders' involvement in relation to, deciding on discussing methodological approach and how the assessment shall be performed. And I think those are important element of the regulation of the proposal that we would see it is that they will contribute to a better outcome of the joint assessment, because this additional expertise is not to ensure that everybody's happy, but is really to have a better outcome. And that's throughout Europe, because that's the other element. We have excellence in HTAs in Europe, but not widespread throughout the member states. So the proposal, we believe, would really contribute to this equity of access to information and access to the evidence base that then it's needed to take the decision.
Thank you. That's been a very interesting and also, I think, very positive view on where we're heading. We have about 15 minutes left. We have a lot of questions, and I have the difficult task of choosing which questions to ask. But given that this is a European panel, and one of the big benefits of being a European citizen is that we do have cross-border healthcare. Patients are able to access care in other countries, whether that's in terms of second opinion through the ERNs, or whether it's in terms of actually traveling to another country to receive care, and as we noted at the beginning, whether it's a matter of making use of the specialist treatment centers that may be available in one country but not another. So I'd like us to turn a little bit to some of those questions of the particular challenges of cross-border care. It was a question raised by one of the discussants directed particularly at Thomas. So Thomas, I'll start with you, but then I'd like to invite anybody else on the panel who would like to comment on the particular issues of cross-border care. But Thomas, perhaps you'd like to kick off and answer the question around the challenges of cross-border care and cell and gene therapy.
Yeah, thanks. Well, to start off, I don't think it's a particular issue for gene therapy or cell and gene therapies, right? And that's also, it's more, I think the European Commission introduced this legislation, more than 10 years ago, when there was probably not even, we didn't talk a lot about cell and gene therapy. So it is more linked to the situation of I would say, rare diseases that need a very specialized treatment, and that is not always available in all the countries. I think why it's more on the table today is that the cell and gene therapies seem to have put some sort of like a turbo on this discussion, because if you talk about specialized treatment, it's even more probably necessary with something quite complex as a cell or a gene therapy. So that's one thing. The challenges is that whilst we have a European legislation on it, there's a directive, there's a regulation, and it actually makes reference to that this is a basic right of every EU citizen. And there's even a specific reference that in particular rare disease patients have a right for getting treatment abroad. The practice, what we've seen is that it doesn't really work very well, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Commission at the moment is reviewing the legislation. And I think why it's not working very well in the end, particularly not for what we're talking about. If not for if you have a hip operation or something like that, I think it works reasonably well. But something quite a complex treatment doesn't work very well. Is I think for a number of reasons. One is that patients, first of all, although they have the rights, the knowledge around this is very limited, right? It's very difficult to find information around this if you sit in the country. And again, the European Commission has put out on the website, DG Santé has put out all kind of information around that, but you need to really, you need to be a Brussels bubble fan if you really want to access that and see what it means, etc. So lack of information is one thing. And also on the physician side, we had a session on this a couple of days ago, where you cannot only talk about patients not knowing about this, physicians don't know about this either, right? That they could maybe work with a confrère abroad, getting the best treatment for their patients. So those are some reasons. And then of course there's the biggest elephant in the room is that you need prior authorization, right? You need prior authorization from your national healthcare system. And that is not easy to obtain because there are probably good reasons why the treatment is not available in the country, and so you need to make that application. And I think that's probably one of the bigger hurdles is how you can get that approval from your national healthcare system to get that treatment abroad. So this, I don't want to. You can talk hours about this, but these are sort of lack of information and how the system works are probably the biggest hurdles that at the moment we need to address.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think there is always the challenge around awareness of the availability of cross-border care. Avril, I'm wondering if this is a thing you would like to comment on, because you did mention the ERNs.
Yes, and to the point already raised, that's exactly the issues that patients are facing. And one of the key issues is if you are under the care of a consultant who is not familiar with this space, you're not going to even know really about the potential of cross-border care. However, if you do, there's challenges, so it just seems to be steeped in challenges for patients right now. However, patients who have a clear diagnosis, particularly in the area of pediatrics, have much more success in traveling to participate in clinical trials, and that can actually happen quite quickly. So it depends on the access that you have and whose care you're under, really, and that's a big challenge, I think, right across the board. The ERN, from a patient perspective, is really the one-stop shop, the area where, all issues with respect to rare diseases can and should be addressed. And, one of the reasons why they were conceived in the first place is really based on that cross-border directive and the fact that, the expertise should follow the patient in as much as possible. And now we have these CPMS systems where, clinicians can share data, and, that is really, really important. But I think it is a reality that, we will not have centers of expertise everywhere. That is just a fact. I mean, I think governments recognize, as do all of the stakeholders, that 27 countries, 28 countries cannot solve this individually. We have to pool our resources and our expertise. That's what the ERNs have been designed for. But I would say, what patients would ask for, constantly in any opportunity we get. So I'm asking again for people to really understand that the ERNs do provide huge opportunity, but they are not as resourced as they could be, and they are fledgling, and they do need supports, and they need engagement but it has the potential to solve many of these problems. I also just want to bring up one other issue, just in case I don't get a chance, sorry, the real world evidence. This is a critical piece. Patients are very engaged in this process. They understand how they can add value here, and are willing to engage, and real world evidence can support the development of patient reported outcome measures right across the board. So patients are here willing to support that action. It's critical to us as well, just to kind of get that in there as well, if I don't get the chance.
Thank you very much. We obviously want to give you as many chances as possible, but as always in these things, time is a little bit against us. Paige, I know that you were going to answer to one of the particular questions that was targeted at you around some of the statistics around clinical trials. Perhaps you could just share your information with that with the audience as a whole.
Yeah, sure. I was just trying to respond to Mr. Cox's question regarding whether or not the UK was included in the statistics I was mentioning. And yes, the answer is the UK is, in terms of those clinical trials and also the number of developers.
Thank you very much. There were some questions also about, and I think one of the things that we've heard is about the need for learning from COVID in terms of new models of collaboration, new models of engagement. And there was a question that was particularly around high-level policy roundtables at EU level and the engagement with the member states. And I guess, Flora, that question may be best directed at you. I don't want to put you on the spot and ask you to commit to anything that is still maybe in development, but from your experience of the HTA discussions, how do you see the involvement of some of the companies and some of the non-political agents involved in policy making, in taking us to the next level in terms of ATMPs?
Well, I think to answer to this last part of the question, I think what we noted in throughout this long and challenging process of negotiation on the HTA proposal, that you could a bit see this, how can I say, a dichotomy between the technical cooperation and the more political discussion. And that's what has probably created also the optimism of the Commission when we presented the proposal in 2018 to think that it would have been relatively quick adoption, because we had a long-standing cooperation at technical level between HTA bodies, very engaged and involved, and this has, through the joint action EUNETA, and not only actually several EU-funded initiatives, but mainly the EUNETA joint action. And there you see how things can actually work and work for the best and work in the interest of the patient and of the sector, actually, for everybody. But then the challenge is more when you bring all this into broader context and also included in the broader discussion on competence, responsibility, which are legitimate, and there are very valid reasons why there is a certain distribution of competence, and that should remain the same, the way it is. But the perception that a scientific cooperation could actually, let's say, interfere with national decision, that has been a major challenge. And I think what the COVID emergency brought in the picture from, as I said earlier, but I think on many levels, is actually the acknowledgement that alone you cannot do it, alone you cannot address the challenge that you have in the specific that you have been posed by COVID, not only because the challenge is enormous, but also because the society is so interconnected. So you cannot think that you close your border and the virus stays out of the borders, because unfortunately that has not, well, it's had to happen, but we have all seen what the consequence. So I think it is a crucial time now for Europe for health policy development. This pandemic has brought and opened up many maybe additional reflection, and many challenges, because also has shown how more difficult it is to agree between many on which vaccine to take, how many doses, and how many, you know, and how which population to provide vaccine to. So it is a challenging time. I'm not saying it will be easy, but I think it will be at least an opportunity to reflect jointly on how we can best address the common challenges, and how we should probably better cooperate in certain area, maybe less in others where it's less essential. But I mean, we cannot all think we all go. I mean, Europe is united in diversity, so it is diverse healthcare system. It are diverse member states, but there are a lot of things that keeps us together, and I think that's where the effort shall be focused. And I think that's the direction where both from the institutional side, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, the member states, are aiming at. So we have, I think, with the Conference of Future of Europe and the ongoing debate on the Health Union package, the pharma strategy, there are many, let's say, opportunities in front of us.
Thank you very much. Now, as we mentioned, this is, as always, time bound, and I have just a few minutes to try and draw some conclusions from what we've heard today. I'll draw those conclusions in a moment, but first I would like to take this opportunity to thank PTC and ARM for having brought this panel to us. So particular thanks to Thomas and Paige. Very grateful also to have had Flora from the European Commission with us, Avril representing the patient perspective on these issues, and of course we're delighted also to have had Professor Razi and MEP Montserrat with us. Now, in terms of how could I summarize all of this, I love things in threes, and I love alliteration. So I'm going to actually come up with the idea that what we've heard about here is really about three things beginning with P. We've heard about the importance of policy that is really targeted and developed towards addressing all of the challenges in bringing cell and gene therapies to market. And that is policies addressing things like new incentives for business, new models around pricing, better adapted clinical trials policies. But it's also the policy that is then needed to drive the right legislative framework. And the right legislative framework actually then brings us to the second P, which is the P of proof. Cell and gene therapies need different types of proof. They need, and we heard at the beginning from Professor Razi about the different approaches needed to data, whether that's new ways of modeling data to answer to new types of HTA questions, whether it's about a different perspective in real world evidence and the need to facilitate a better engagement of patients within providing real world evidence. And that in turn leads, I think, to the third P, which is the P of, and I'm cheating a little bit, it's the P of patient centricity. And if there's one thing that I think is always there in healthcare, but particularly there in these conditions where we're talking mainly about rare diseases, is patient centricity. It's the recognition that we often have expert patients who very often know much more about their condition than the clinicians working with them, but also people who are, whether they're as parents or as people living with diseases, who are very, very actively involved in their daily management of conditions. And we need to foster new ways of really bringing that patient centricity into the story, whether it's through things like ERNs or better access to cross-border healthcare, or simply in new models of clinical trials. That patient centricity is absolutely key. And all three of those Ps then demand three As, and they are awareness, access, and agency. And I think, Thomas, you put it beautifully, cross-border healthcare is lovely, but if nobody knows about it, it's not going to get anywhere. And that's why the access piece comes in, of course. Access is whether it's cross-border or whether it's in terms of national reimbursement structures, we need to deal with access. but all of those require new models of agency, and agency meaning all the different players coming together. And that brings me to the final point, which is that everybody has alluded to. COVID has been, in a strange way, a blessing for this sector. It has taught us new skills. It's taught us new issues about collaboration and collaborative platforms. It's proven that we can have agility in terms of both funding and in terms of legislative processes, but we mustn't lose that. We must seize those lessons, make COVID be the driver for better cell and gene therapies, so that we can develop the proof, the policy, and the patient centricity that we need. I hope with that I've been able to do you justice in bringing your ideas together in a little way. We've had a huge audience with us, well over 100 people most of the time. We've had a great panel, and I'd really like to thank you all for your engagement and the passion you brought to this. And maybe that's the fourth P. It takes passion, and you've demonstrated it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for moderating. Thanks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.